dozen papers or 50, then the special issue of a journal is almost out. Because then you select some and you do not select others, and I think you know, of course it has to go through, all of them will have to go through the blind review. So whereas in a volume, I think the previous one, no, not the previous one, but the one before that, Svea brought it as a volume in my series. And that has, I don't remember the exact number of chapters, but it's 16. Yeah. So if people are willing to contribute here, then they can all be put in one place. So that, you know, I would recommend.
I think there's still another argument for doing it more on the volume than the special issue of the journal, because most of the presentations were not specific for one study and elaborating on it, but as we call it, not only making some suggestions to one specific element, but theoretical reasoning, overgeneralizations, maybe things for further ongoing, which is not usually the case in journal articles. Although in some review articles, but
yeah, sure,
there's
sure.
no.
Yeah.
I think there's no journal having special issues on reviews.
No,
on 16
no,
different
right.
reviews.
Yeah. I think, and also we are bringing in a lot of different studies in each chapter. So I would think that, you know, that would be my suggestion, that we bring it as a volume rather than as a.
And all of that makes sense. The problem with volumes is they're very expensive, and libraries are really cutting back on their budgets. So if there was some way we could almost do a self-publishing, that would be, I think.
Yeah, I don't know how to do the self-publishing.
I think it's probably not so difficult, and I think the publicity is simpler. You're going to basically distribute it to libraries, maybe advertise in the back of journals, all that. But I don't know what the sales of these volumes are. But
I don't know the exact numbers, but I know that the Springer has kind of an agreement to send it to all the libraries. So mostly they are looking at libraries. A lot of libraries subscribe to that as a whole series. So it's not just ordering a book by book, but out of the libraries, they just subscribe to the entire series. So
if you look at the prices for an individual, I mean, we're not even sometimes for a library. So maybe that's something that we should investigate.
Yeah, if somebody wants to take the lead on how to publish independently, that's fine.
I look into it. It is as difficult as it seems.
But then,
I will encourage our young generation, like Dami, Anna, Shelly, Bobby, that they will take care of it. And we do two things. First of all, we will find out. And the second, we just send a mail, and we will see how many people are willing, or up to, everybody is willing, but up to now, if the time that is better, like to contribute now for a volume or a special issue, then we will decide. So you will get a mail, and please answer.
Right. Yes. And also give a deadline.
Yes. Once we will know if we have it all, we will give a deadline, of course. So please bear in mind that you have commitment. Yes.
I'm sorry I have to leave a little bit early, but I just wanted to say first thank you for all the conference. It was not easy to sit 3 days to listen, and I learned a lot. I think the one thing I'm thinking about is what is really fluency? Because people are using so many different measures and so many different variables, so many different levels, and that's why you get kind of mixed mixed results each time. So as a group, we might develop some notion about what fluency is really about.
So maybe we'll give Linda, who will now takes the lead, and then we will be able to open it for discussion.
Yeah, I think that is a very important question. So imagine that you have to pick one measure of fluency. What would you pick?
Me?
Yeah.
There was one theory which did not really result in good results. It was the rodding theory of Carver. He was trying to do some combination of the word level and the comprehension level, but it didn't result in anything. For me, it's something which is the efficiency in which you get good results in comprehension, not only. So I don't know about any simple measure to measure it, but it has to do, if we're talking about reading, it has to include the results and maybe some underlying things that Avi was talking about, which I do not fully understand, about procedure and
Okay.
Yeah.
I actually think that I would be inclined to think of fluency in terms of fluency in, rather than fluency as a general term. So I think, and I actually had during this meeting some very good indication. Just remind us about one presentation we had today about eye movements, and it's very clear that some effects which emerge in reading text are simply not to be found when we are measuring speed of processing or fluency aspects in single words. So I think that my first suggestion would be actually specifying fluency in single word reading, lexical decision, and so on, which is just as good as any other, but it would allow for comparisons, because if we use the same term for many, many different types of measurements, it's going to introduce a lot of noise. My second suggestion, however, is perhaps even more radical, because I tend to think of as fluency not only in language domains, and definitely not only in reading, and I think it's something that we should use not as a term which implies yes, no, but rather as a type of continuum, and I think it's a state. However, it is a state of knowledge and ability which I think can be acquired only very late or after sufficient amount of experience and the setting up of many, many other aspects which have to be learned in order to solve the specific task for which fluency is positive. So what I would actually suggest, and it's definitely used in several other domains other than language, is to think as fluency as a very advanced stage in which things can be done in a skilled manner. But this brings me to the fact that even I think in most of the presentations, skills were used in many, many different manners, because skills were as the word was used as factors, it was used as acquired knowledge, efficient acquired knowledge, very effective acquired knowledge, or just basic knowledge. So it's what I think fluency is actually acquired knowledge which is presented or reflected in very high levels of performance in measures of both speed and accuracy. So I think that I would not call inaccurate performance, which is done very fast, as fluent. And I would reserve fluent for very fast performance, not at the cost of accuracy. So in fact, again, it implies that this is some type of state in which speed accuracy trade-off costs have changed. So it's something which needs to be developed.
Well, although I think with the second point, I agree with you, except that that's why I never wanted to study fluency in beginning readers. And how do you decide that they're accurate enough to be fluent? And I was quite surprised at how quickly you can measure fluency and they're quite accurate.
Absolutely. I actually think that there is fluency in very simple tasks, fluency in very complex tasks, and there are lots of skills at the fluency stage in very young children. So I think that's part of the point. I'm probably not very clear, but at least intuitively, my idea is that one can reach fluency for a certain task and conditions and task demands, but then this is only a basis for generating even more complex task solutions and so on. And I would argue that we never get to full fluency except when our experience stops. But as long as we have more or accumulated experience, there is opportunity for increasing of our fluency. And the point probably that fluency can be measured even in beginners is, I think, a very good one. And there shouldn't be any, at least I'm not surprised, because in laboratory conditions, in most of the tasks that we actually test, whether perceptual or motor, we actually start with beginners. So we devise the tasks such as to make sure that they really have a problem in initial performance. And yes, very far, if we do the appropriate protocols, it's not that easy to teach. As I'm sure many of you share this experience with me, because people tend, on the other hand, to think that teaching and training process are so easy. All you have to do is just, and then the protocol works, and we know that this is not the case. So definitely to attain fluency is, you need to have a few tricks, and there's certainly some constraints. But even in tasks where you are a complete beginner, given a good learning or training experience, one can get to fluency. That doesn't say that if you get to a certain level of fluency, this is the end. And in fact, I think even in the simplest tasks that I can imagine, that people working in perceptual and motor domains have been using, it's very clear that what one can get from a single training session is qualitatively different from what one would get from multi-session training, and definitely complex tasks which has to do, which we are interested in, such as reading. This is a very, very multi-session type of acquisition process. And what I would like to suggest, however, is that fluency is something we have to take, if you want, in deciding or looking at efficiency of processing and understanding what type of process actually supports task solution, that we must take into account that one of the parameters, and perhaps the most important parameter that has to be optimized, is speed. And I think that's the main theme that was running around, because I think that speed has something important and special for the system. And what we are trying to do, this is my understanding, in actually making sure that we are performing tasks as smoothly and fast as possible. So yes, accuracy is important, but on top of accuracy, we want something else, which is really doing it in a fast and efficient manner. Now, speed in itself, I think, reflects something about efficiency. So it's not that speed per se is the important, but in fact it reflects a type of task solution which is more efficient. Now, how you measure efficiency, that's another question. But in all these studies where comprehension is the target, or understanding comprehension, we all have this deep feeling that, or intuition, that we have to explain it in more than by speed and accuracy per se. The point is, speed, however, is critical, and that's essential. But it's speed per task.
You started off with,
I'm really sorry, yeah, I need to leave. Bye everyone, it was wonderful spending time with you.
with fluency in. And I think we probably all would agree in word reading and pseudo-word reading. Okay, but how do we measure fluency in comprehension, or sentence fluency?
No, I was just going to add two quick points to what Avi was saying. And of course, as you know, in all the panels that came out of NIH, there was a general agreement. We'll do single word fluency versus text fluency as the starting point, and see if there are some common principles. But the one point I want to add to, you know, there is the brain-based perspective that Avi takes and I'm taking. I mean, just a 2-second example. We just submitted a paper with good and poor readers. And poor readers are faster than controls at impossible figures, at looking at these geometric shapes and rejecting the ones that couldn't be in 3D, and they're slower at reading. And so we replicated that effect. This was the third sample. And then we mapped it in the brain, and you can see whichever task is easier has lower fronto-basal ganglia activity. It's a disordinal interaction. So there is a brain perspective on, which I think some of us would bring into this volume. But there's another older perspective that we are missing here, and we should probably bring back, and you know what I'm getting at. This is automaticity, and the nightmare that automaticity theory brought up. But people like Gordon Logan, where it's not just speed, but it's the stabilization and reduction in variance, the work on dual task, and the ability, you know, there's a lot of psychophysics out there. I'm looking at him because he did that stuff too. And there, it would be great to get somebody, I mean, I could kind of do it, because I grew up in that. But to sort of get back to those old notions, because when the system self-organizes to a point where it requires no top-down control, this is usually what cognitive scientists mean by becoming automatic, and ultimately it's related to the concept of fluency, but there's like, you know, and so I would say we should have on the table some cognitive science, and finally computational models. There's a lot of people that do mathematical models of what automaticity / fluency means. So even though it's adding more to the big mess, I think it would be interesting to bring the perspective here as well. And I think, I mean, I could kind of represent some of that in what I would contribute, but there might be other people I'd want to reach out to, and I think it would bring another perspective to all of this.
Well, so is there some way we could add that as a dimension, or as a paper, or how to?
That's what I'm thinking. I mean, there's the brain-based definition that I think, brain-based research on what it means for something to become easy, and that's what we're all referring to. I think we all look at that, Scott, and any of us mapping the brain. But then there is a lot of cognitive science on what it means to become less variable and more stable over time as you overlearn something. And I think that never gets applied to psycholinguistics or reading, and probably could be in some interesting ways. But it's a minor point, but I think it would put some context on what we're trying to do, because this is a big problem. And I was on a lot of stuff over the years, especially at NIH, on this issue of fluency, and it always had these, you know, you'd hit a brick wall at some point with all the people, and finally you'd say, okay, single word versus comprehend text, and let's go home. But maybe we could do something better, you know. maybe we
Is
could
the
do
question
something.
to try to reach agreement on a fluency measure? Is that what you're asking? Because that will never happen in this
No, yeah.
community.
Yeah.
Right? It's not possible.
No, I think it's to provide a set of findings and arguments that would allow a reader to do that. In other words, to provide the information they need to kind of go beyond us. I think, because you're right, there would be no consensus here.
As an example, you're aware of the original NIH pediatric database.
Yep.
We got a group of psychologists, psychiatrists, and physicists together to define what would go into the database, what neurocognitive measures would be used to define normal, what imaging measures. The physicists met in one room, and a half an hour later we were done. We agreed on the protocol, we came back. The psychiatrists and psychologists were throwing things at each other,
Yeah.
and that lasted for three more days. They never reached agreement.
Right.
3 years later, they finally whittled the protocol for testing normal from 27 hours to 9 hours. And the project ended up $10 million and 4 years overtime.
Sure.
So with the second database, they chose one site. They put a physicist in charge of it. We agreed on a neuropsych battery that's 2.5 hours, and the protocol was easy to define. So I would argue that probably you want to get out of behavioral measures for defining what fluency is, and either make it a neuroimaging marker that defines a normative circuit, which I think we now know what it looks like.
Yeah.
But not everybody can do that to their patients. Or a computer-based measure. And it strikes me that RAP would be a very nice way to do that. It could be turned from a training to a diagnostic measure of fluency. But I think if you try to reach agreement between educators, psychologists, and other, cognitive groups, you will never do that in terms of measuring.
Let me just, I agree, Scott, and I've been on some of those over the years, so I know. But I don't think, at least my understanding of what we're talking about is not to try to get this group to define fluency, but to provide a set of interrelated articles that would maybe make it a little bit easier. Because frankly, I would not be satisfied with either a simple speeded measure, given what we know about the cognitive science of this, which complicates everything, or the brain-based measure. But I don't think that was what's on the table. If we were looking as a group to define fluency, I think you've answered it. But I think if we're looking as a group to define the landscape for thinking about fluency from very different perspectives, yours, mine, and the others, then that's a different mission. And so we have to answer, are we, because I didn't understand this charge to be coming up with a consensus definition. That would be like, as Scott rightly said, we would be here until
more than before the train leaves.
Exactly. So, but how do you see it, Svi?
Let me say
Linda,
something.
oh sorry.
Let me say something. When one comes older, it's more and more common that one starts thinking that this is absolutely too complex to reach the goal. So we have to have the goal set in such a way that we reach it. And if we wanted to have such a goal, what about having when the dysfluency is a bottleneck? So only this perspective. When dysfluency is a bottleneck, yeah, yes, meaning that when it's compromising your opportunity to benefit, to use written language. Just from this perspective, because almost all of these papers somehow looked this perspective, but it would give it much sharper focus to what we are doing. And then we could concentrate not only defining when it's bottleneck and which types of, in which forms it may become to be a bottleneck, and also what to do to open this bottleneck. But this is of course the most important.
But Peggy, just from, again, I'll just repeat it one more time and I'll stop, but that I think is one of the volume, or one of the chapters on disfluency and bottleneck. Because I don't think, my understanding is that we're not here to come up with something that's going to be adopted by anybody, because you know how we are, and he does too. But I do think we're trying to get some very interesting minds who have very different disciplines and methodologies to put their 2 cents into a document. Now, there might be a summary chapter where somebody, like Professor Siegel would make sense of everything we're done, but I think it's better to think about this as multiple perspectives on an issue, so that for 2 things: single word fluency and all that entails, and text fluency and all that entails, and how much they're reducible to common neurobiologic principles, or the trade between flexibility and stability and the need for the brain to, all of that stuff. There's a whole set of chapters on that as well that could go in. But I do think we could do some good for the reading community if we had those 2 broad constructs and we had people provide multiple sources of perspectives on it. I know I want to read it, frankly. So that's another way of thinking about this. And then, as Heikki says, the disfluency bottleneck is what most of us study, and so it should be a big part of it, but I'm not sure it's the only part.
I think from your idea, it would be better to have not a type of brain-mind fluency, but brain-mind and reading speed, and then fluency as the goal or the perspective, looking on these 3 approaches to research.
And the other thing that we always, because I work in a place where we do this, like, this is how we write all our grants, and this is why we've succeeded over the years. We're always doing these kinds of consensus, interdisciplinary conversations. One thing we would want to get out of this, I think, is new research. So I think if you're going to have a volume, you're going to want everybody to put their 2 cents in on what should be the next great experiment. And there you might actually find some consensus. There might be, everybody's asking, wants to know about something. And I think it would be interesting to kind of interrogate all these brains on where the next great experiment should be, where the great challenges are. And then you get them all to do the cross-language, and we're done. My thoughts. Anyway.
In a way, if I hear correctly what you're saying, is that we have several layers here. Some people think that we have to focus on reading, which is sentence or comprehension. By the way, if we will take Avi's side of the whole debate, Avi started to say fluency in what? My question earlier about domain general, domain specific was really related to what Avi said. Are we having some kind of infrastructure for fluency in general, which relate to most of the things that we are doing, or some of the things, or only to the language part, or the motor part, or to the mathematics part, I don't know. And it tied somehow together somewhere in the brain system, somewhere, probably in the lower level, or not. Or we have a separate, knowing the brain, as I always say that he is lazy, probably you have one system that's helping us to do the most. Talking about speed, accuracy, as we discussed it before, I think that we have a continuum, we have a road. Start with accuracy, but it is not enough. And in order to come all the way to the automaticity, you have to speed up in a way. But speeding up not necessarily relates to reading comprehension, because sometimes I have to pause, and I'm not speeding up in order to think deeply. So I'm doing lente, not festina. So I have to balance what I call synchronization between not only between the various brain systems, but also between many, many other things. And when things are synchronized together, either bottom up, top down, interactive, visual, auditory, whatever you say, yes? A deep thought, a quick thought, anything, when you synchronize between it, then you can reach fluency. And then you can really speak about fluency when things are really synchronized. And I agree, when I was many years ago, when people were laughing at me, said that accuracy and speed are the one in many papers that we published. I pointed out that we have to take under consideration the accuracy, it's not enough, and the speed is not enough, but together. So I don't know. I think that we have really, we can talk about different things, and we can all be right in a way. Just to open the horizon a little bit. Now, talking about a term of measuring it, that's a problem, because if we are sitting in the laboratory, sorry, our laboratory is closed now for the safari reasons, we can use eye tracker, we can use EEG, we can use FNIRS. If Avi will allow us, we can also use fMRI. But what do we do in school? What do we do when we go to the class? What do we do when we go to the clinics? Are we taking the machine with us? It's a bit funny. So, and most of the work that basically we are doing is going to the field, or somebody is going to the field at the end point. And then, if we already know that fluency incorporates, now I can talk, so my opening remark, if we are talking about something that it is independent variable, and it is kind of monitored, and it has a large way of changing, you can change from very slow to a little bit more, and it is open-ended. So I think that it can be trained, so what do we do with it? Much easier than to train maybe other part of reading skills that we are somehow having a lot of difficulties. So anyway.
Just have one comment to the authenticity idea. From my perspective, authenticity is more a goal of fluency. It's the end point. If we have no frontal lobe activity, then we have perhaps reached it. And I think fluency gives us a chance as a concept to put into the scientific reasoning the steps we have to go to reach this goal. So fluency is more provocative for me than authenticity.
Right, I agree.
Attaining fluency is actually a process, and definitely would have phases. So one can think about something that can grow, and definitely interventions can make a difference. Teaching can make a difference in the attainment. But I think probably this is a general process. The generation of fluency is a general process in acquisition of any skill, but not only in the domain of language, and definitely not only in reading. So fluency develops walking and speaking, both, but it also develops in our ability to decipher movies.
Are they related to each other? That is my question.
I think the process is probably, so I agree with Tzvia, it's probably a very small repertoire of the same type of processes which is shared across different domains. So the process is the same. It's the same processes of plasticity. Not many, that's similar control, probably processes on plasticity in many different domains. However, what is being optimized or being made fluent is very much domain specific. And in terms of reading, I think it's an empirical question of whether gaining fluency at the lexical level makes a difference in gaining fluency in reading sentences or in understanding them. That's an empirical question. But if one approaches it from a diagnostic or measurement perspective, then I think we should be very, very careful and always specify fluency in the specific task we're using.
Now you introduced a different concept, and that was automaticity and essentially reducing the variance, assuming this is within an individual. But one of the issues in working with children is that they change over time.
I'm very happy you brought this up, because we actually have data in adults doing the same thing, and then a new set of variants opens up. So yes, for some parameters of performance, automaticity reduces variance, but then if you really have a better solution, you open up a new set of variants which was not available before that. And it happens even in adults. So it's not only children. So, which is why I tend to think of it as growing rather than automaticity, because automaticity, you are left with the same machinery being pushed to the limit. And I think that what happens in terms of learning is that we actually generate in the process a new set of machinery or new solutions. And definitely in the brain, there's huge shifts in the way the same process is done. And we know there's a very strong brain basis for our, even the simple statistics of high frequency versus low frequency nouns. So it's not that how are nouns or verbs or whatever represented in the brain, how are very frequent in this language. So it's definitely the condition that makes the difference. What I'm trying to say is that there are huge shifts in task solutions, which are qualitative shifts. And so it's the same brain, but it solves the problem differently. And this is why we will see variance going down, but then it opens up in other domains, because this is growth. So automaticity is, I agree, it's a problematic metaphor, because it assumes that we have the same machinery throughout, and it's not true. We do develop and we definitely grow new solutions toward problems.
So we have our behavioral measures of change. But how are you, I'll just ask this in general, what about the brain measures? Do you see, well, you showed some, but it seems to me that needs to really move forward in looking at the brain changes as develop, as you become more proficient in reading or whatever.
Yeah, maybe I can add something to that. I mean, I think the brain measures offer unique possibility to look beyond output, beyond performance. And I mean, we've had now a discussion about performance. I mean, how you define time performance, the accurate, or the qualitatively good performance. But I think it's really important to go beyond the integrated level without forgetting it, obviously. In the end, it's the performance that counts. And I was struck a bit, I think, in this conference, one of the strengths is that we really have different domains or different abilities represented. So I think fluency is a great concept, because it offers a new approach to look at speed and accuracy in different skill domains, and also on a developmental background, which I think is really important, which would be strength. But in terms of measures, I really was struck by the fact that the time measures and the timing measures are really, and have been actually poorly represented. So I think the ERPs and the oscillatory phenomena that really give us a very direct grasp at timing and synchronicity and things like that, they were not at the core. People are always more impressed by the images, right? By the spatial distributions of which networks get more activated, which networks get less activated, but that's not really getting at fluency. So I think there is really an opportunity, not in the clinical reality. I don't suggest that we buy a portable magnet and drive around in Israel, right? Or even do testing of all the children with EEG. but in terms of understanding what is happening here, in terms of conceptualizing what we mean with fluency, I think it's really important to look at component processes, at networks, and get at physiological measures in terms of variability of these processes, in terms of their timing, and part of that we can do with the fMRI. I mean, but many of the things you can do much better with electrophysiological measures. So I really think that would be a recommendation to go in this direction and to really use that in order to really bring the temporal aspect at a really at the level where it counts, sub-second level, millisecond level, back into a research focus across domains, and fluency is a good concept to raise that issue again.
I mean, an objective biomarker for fluency, whatever that is, would be wonderful, but I agree with you, it's not really practical to do that with a technological solution. But, I mean, I said it half jokingly, but I think your program actually measures this. I sat and did the demo in English, and it gave me a score of words per minute, and then I, did some more training, and it improved a little bit. And you're doing that because you want to set the pace of the program, but you're also giving a measure, a numerical measure, which is linked to comprehension and performance. It's telling you words per minute with comprehension, because the minute you stop being able to answer the questions, you stop advancing the pace. So, is there any better measure of fluency than what you're doing to assess the pace that you set the program for the child?
Well,
I can't think of one.
That's an important point, because what you're doing is you're looking at learning. You're not saying this is your absolute level of fluency when you come into the room. You're actually looking at change, which is, I think, a much better measure of a cognitive process than just saying, okay, this is your fluency rate.
Well, and you get an asymptote out of that as well. So you
Yeah.
can determine how far is this individual at this point in their development capable of going. And you give them an opportunity to reach that optimal performance. It seems like it's a pretty good measure of fluency.
It's a testing the limits approach too.
Yeah.
In the limit as.
One point I thought that to reduce the standard deviation, you remember our talk years ago on the river in Budapest, we walked. So to reduce the within subject, reduction of the variance, that might be also one of the indication of a better fluent performance. I mean, the variance is one of the obstacles for individual variance, I mean, within subject. It might be one of the obstacles for this fluent performance in a way. And once it becomes more unit, that might be also. But I agree with you. Really, is what you say.
I think also back to what Abby spoke about, that fluency is also efficiency, and what Svea said, because you can be automatic in something and do it very fast, but you're not efficient, you don't do it well. So I think actually fluency is the level where you do it fast and correct. I mean, you do have to stop, and you do have to have some monitoring, and then you're fluent. But if you don't have any monitoring at all, then you're automatic, but you're not efficient. So I think it's different definitions that need to be, to make sure that we understand what we're talking about. But I think what you said also about the program, that it's checking your speed with the comprehension, that's the great thing, that it is speed and accuracy, and it's changing it. Then you do get to your level where you're fast enough and understand. That's very important, the comprehension.
One thing that really puzzles me all the time, that if the acceleration not phenomenon, the training is working, so really, and the dyslexic or learning disabled, doesn't matter, can do better. Even a little bit in mathematics we heard about it from you, and not only in reading. Why they don't do it by themselves? Why they don't, life didn't teach them to do it. They are capable to do it. So in a way, something is there. And do they always need an outside monitor, a manipulation, somebody who will manipulate their way of living, of reading, or whatever? What is it there that really preventing them to do it in a way? So I can imagine that not to do things because you can't, you cannot. I mean, there is obstacles, but here they can.
But it's not fun, it's not motivation. I told Avi that my son got homework, the assignment was learn the multiplication facts. Come on. I mean, who will do it? They are able to do it, but you need to be motivated to do it. It's not fun on the way to being proficient, and this is something that we need to do at the educational system.
But you also need feedback.
And feedback, yeah. So both
And that's
motivation
why
and feedback.
we need the program.
Yeah.
By the way, it's not that clear. For example, in the basic task where the idea that processing time can be shortened many years ago, which is actually a conceptual task in which the delayed gains and the notion of consolidation phase after learning experience actually was first found. And in that task, feedback, online feedback, was actually very bad for young adults. And they were more effective in learning. Of course, they had a knowledge about their performance by their own intuition, but the idea that we actually saw in the data was that whenever we provided feedback per se, per each trial, we were slowing down their learning and lowering their performance, and it was much better to actually start from very easy, where we are sure that they will be able to maintain a high level of accuracy, then move very slowly, as implemented in the current program, to more and more demanding conditions, rather than providing
What were they
direct.
learning?
They were learning a visual discrimination task of finding a target embedded in
Okay,
in
But that's something where, when you get the right answer, it's obvious. But in many things, it's not so obvious. And yet that might be true of that kind of task, but in a reading task, or a reading copy, it's not so obvious.
I completely agree, and so I think that the answer is really what are the task demands, and I think the more the task demands are restrictive, we are actually posing a different problem to our brains, and hopefully it will grow to the right solution. I think this is the one answer to Zvia's question, that time constraints do something very magical by themselves, but of course we have to make sure that we train to the task that we want the brain to develop a better solution. And of course there are many different conditions. However, one of them is whether we want or we don't want to actually participate in this experience. And this is a biological factor, because we can use it to an advantage, and we can down-regulate the generation of long-term memory by going in the other direction. So this is a real constraint. It's a biological constraint. It's not just willingness of the subject and so on. This is a real constraint, and we know of others. So what I'm saying is that there are structural aspects of a learning experience which, if we don't introduce, we are not going to get the fluency. And fluency in terms of coming up with a better solution which is both efficient and fast. So there are such, and in fact some of the problems could be interference after a very effective training experience. So that they should not even occurring concurrently with the actual, I don't know, second language training. It could be something that will occur within hours afterwards and still affect whether or not the training experience will be important. So definitely there is the biology which we must consider, but I think the main message was that we should take very seriously time constraints and time measures if you want to understand how the brain actually acquires or improves on certain skills. And so fluency in that respect is a good idea to introduce, because it says it's not only accuracy. Things have to go fast and efficient. And the second aspect is that there's development, there are phases, and there are big changes which I think are qualitative. So what we actually acquire on the way is new solutions which we grow. So it's not only machine optimization and automaticity, it's actually growing new solution or switching in terms of which areas are critical.
I think it's interesting that 3 people now have mentioned the common theme. Only one of you actually named it, which is motivation. You asked why the brain does it. You said the brain is lazy. You were talking about the will to participate. Do you want to do it? And I actually disagree with you, Ken. I don't think that when you achieve automaticity, it means you lose the top-down modulation. I think it's always there, and I think it always needs to be. And I think motivation is an important part of it. It's the one part of executive function nobody's ever identified biologically. We know working memory, speed of processing, some of these aspects of it, but I'm not sure that we can put our finger on which part of the brain is responsible for the motivation. If we could, maybe we put TMS
Why?
Well,
The
over it.
dopaminergic system, which is, no,
Yeah,
seriously,
yeah.
the dopaminergic system, which is also associated with learning, and rightfully so. So maybe you can go down there and back there. So it's motivation and feedback in combination. What's the best feedback to
And it also probably explains a lot of the variance that you're talking about. Because today I might be motivated to read. Tomorrow I might prefer to be on
Depends
the
on what
beach.
book you read. It
Yeah,
depends on what
that's
book
true
you
too.
read.
Right.
So it has a huge influence.
I think, Scott, just a quick point. I think I might have introduced a loaded term into this conversation about 45 minutes ago, automaticity. Automaticity in cognitive science does imply less executive function because we formally measure it with dual task interference. And this is a very well-established mathematical model of what it means to be able to do something and do other things with your frontal lobe. And so, of course, it's never, you're absolutely right, and I agree. But
And there's a top-down process that flips that switch and says, okay, now we'll do it automatically.
No, I know, and that's why I'm saying there's no real disagreement. It's just the relative stability, which some behaviors need less variance, even though at some point you need to be able to pop out of that state and learn new stuff. But I think the relative, so I mean automaticity, it's been doing this since 1980. You bring it in and then you get hurt, and for good reason. But I think we're all getting to similar constructs. I just have, and I agree with you. Just one thing I really think we need to concern ourselves with. If you think fluency is a pain in the neck to define, and what about comprehension? And we all, we all know this. So let me just make a point. Let me just make my point. Okay, the cognitive science the community has tried to contribute to the assessment community. Paul Vanderbroek, people like that have tried. We're all involved in these things. To try to get at the components, the systems, the retrieval, this, all of these knowable dimensions. That's been a big pain in the neck as well. I think, as Svea said before, when you're a really fluent reader, you should be able to slow down to comprehend. So I think we have to divorce comprehension out of this conversation and go back to what my colleague Hollis Scarborough likes to say. There's the skill of reading and there's reading. Now the skill of reading includes single word and connected text fluency, whatever that becomes. And the rest of it, which we should be studying, needs to become able to be done without the machinery of the decoding and the connected text getting in the way. I mean, there is some merit to the bottleneck idea that Heike raises. And the bottleneck occurs not only at the single word, but at the level. So I think we are mostly focused here on the skill of reading and not reading. And then when we get to comprehension, what it means to be a good comprehension, I like you raised it. Maybe to be good at comprehension and fluent is to be slow. I don't know. But it's a whole other animal, as we know. And probably we should pull them apart and focus on what most speed-focused research goes to, which is the ability to get out of vision and into language fast, which is really this is the whole solution. And then use the biologic machinery for comprehension and retrieval and syntax and all of those interorganized processes for free.
Except going with James' very nice data today,
yes,
it could very well be that revenge will come back, because it seems that our lexical and more higher level knowledge actually will affect what we see.
Sure.
So it's not that it's a never-ending interaction between two systems. Well, it's probably much more than two systems, but it's more than vision feeding into language. It's also language telling vision what we have actually seen. So, and of course, there's a lot of motor components, because we have to look to see, and so on. So I think that fluency in this respect is also a very important notion, because it takes off from a single notion of accuracy in decoding and puts a more interesting story towards efficiency and time constraints. So I think that
that's a good point. I'm only saying if for the denizens of hell who study comprehension, including some of the young people in my lab, and study comprehension-specific disorders, I pray for them at night because it's so difficult. They don't care about fluency. All they care about is being able to have the fluency you need to be able to not be putting your energy into text. Beyond that, they really don't. And what you said reminded me, because real comprehension is enriched processing and flexibility and set shifting, and that takes time. So all I'm saying is we use the word comprehension. We use the dependent measure comprehension, which is how many things you get right on a test, which, as Jack Fletcher will say, it's a perfectly valid and reliable measure. It just doesn't measure the deeper aspects of comprehension. I'm just saying, I think we should take comprehension out of this and make that another conference, if you will, and focus on.
I very much agree with you.
That's all I'm saying.
But if we're going to talk about comprehension, we better be very specific about how we're measuring.
Exactly. Exactly. But if we're at fluency, I think that's like a bridge too far. Comprehension.
Yeah. Maybe we can go back to the old work of what's her name? I think Gottman Heisler in England. She was talking about poses, good poses and bad poses.
Yeah.
In speech, in reading.
Of course.
Yeah,
wow,
cognitive poses and all kind of old stuff.
That's old school.
So I think it's...
Yeah. So, shall I, talking about back to the beginning of the conversation, the volume of this issue, shall we try to go for it? What do you think? Will you? Shall we try to go for it, or shall we at least try to communicate on it? Yeah.
I'm totally. I'm open to it. I'm just speaking for myself. None of us have a lot of time, but I like these conferences to yield a permanent trace. And otherwise,
That's what we did before.
Otherwise, they're fun.
You remember?
I know exactly.
Yeah. That's what we did before. Okay, so we will communicate by email.